Hello, this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and as part of our video series, we are now going to talk about wheel regenerative chatter. We talked previously about workpiece regenerative chatter, which is more common, and that tends to occur pretty quickly, often just within the first few seconds of when you make contact with the workpiece, with the wheel. Wheel regenerative chatter is less common, but it's still out there. And we're going to talk about the fundamental mechanisms or the fundamental cause of wheel regenerative chatter. We're not going to get into solutions just yet. The goal of this is to explain to you what the fundamental mechanism is. You might want to first watch the video on workpiece regenerative chatter because it's more common, number one, and number two, it's sort of the same mechanism. Just one is occurring on the workpiece and one is occurring on the wheel. And then after that, watch the wheel regenerative chatter one, this video, where I explain the fundamental mechanisms of what is actually causing the chatter. So let's take a look at the Book of Grinding. Book of Grinding is 4,000 pages of material. If you take one of my courses, you get a copy of the Book of Grinding. These are some excerpts of the Book of Grinding. And we're going to talk about wheel regenerative chatter, not workpiece regenerative chatter, but wheel regenerative chatter. So in a similar fashion of workpiece regenerative chatter, we have a wheel, and that wheel likes to bounce up and down at its natural frequency. So that wheel spindle assembly, stiffness assembly, likes to bounce up and down, let's say at 120 bounces a second. If you had a very unstiff ID grinding wheel, 120 bounces a second might be reasonable. If you have a cylindrical OD grinder that's reasonably stiff, you might be looking at 500 bounces a second or 500 hertz. We chose 120 here just to make it easier to visualize. More typical frequencies would be, say, 400, 500, 600 if you have a very stiff spindle, something like that. And so we've got the wheel going at 1800 RPM, 30 revs a second, and we have the workpiece going at 720 RPM. A little bit fast, I realize, but we're doing this just to make it easier to visualize. Typical workpiece RPMs would be smaller than that. Not always, sometimes they'll get up that high, but typically they'll be lower. Okay, so that wheel likes to bounce up and down at 120 bounces a second. He likes to bounce up and down 120 bounces a second at a fast wheel speed, slow wheel speed, 120 bounces a second, 120 hertz. Big forces, small forces, no forces at all, whatever, that spindle still likes to bounce up and down at 120 bounces a second. If he's stiff, he'll bounce at a higher frequency. If he's not stiff, he'll bounce at a lower frequency. If he's heavy, more massive, he'll bounce at a lower frequency. If he's less massive or not heavy, he will bounce at a higher frequency. As a general rule, we want that guy to bounce up and down at a high frequency. Okay, so that guy bounces up and down. Now, as we saw in the last video, that bouncing up and down puts lobes into the workpiece. That's workpiece regenerative chatter, but we're not talking about workpiece regenerative chatter today. Workpiece is more common. We're talking about wheel regenerative chatter, which is less common, but it's still there. It takes longer to develop. So workpiece regenerative chatter can happen within just a few seconds of contact. Wheel regenerative chatter can take several minutes to develop because it relies on wear of the wheel. If you have an aluminum oxide wheel, it might take 5 or 10 minutes, 20 minutes to develop. If you have a CBN wheel, it might take 40 minutes or an hour to develop between dressings. So let's take a look at what actually is going on. So this guy's bouncing up and down, boing, 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 boing. And he's bouncing up and down 120 times a second. And the wheel is rotating at 30 times a second. 120 divided by 30 is 4. So every time the wheel makes one revolution, he has bounced up and down, boing, 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 4 times. And every time he bounces up and down, he wears a little bit more on the area he's bouncing at. So it'd be nice if my wheel wore evenly all the way around, but that's not going to happen because that wheel has a proclivity, a propensity to bounce up and down. But it's not a big deal. He bounces up and down and he wears 4 lobes on the wheel. Not a big deal, though. Everything's okay. We exaggerate here in this video, but it's just a little bit of more wear around certain parts of the wheel. But now if we have that little bit more wear around certain parts of the wheel, what's going to happen? That force is going to vary. And that force is going to vary, acting on the wheel, and that force acts as an excitation force to cause that wheel to bounce up and down. So now the force is going, and that force is going at exactly 120 bounces a second. Why? Because that's exactly the number of lobes we put in the wheel when we were bouncing up and down. So now we've got a vicious cycle. So we're putting in 4 lobes into the wheel, and then those 4 lobes in the wheel are exciting the system at exactly its natural frequency. And that's exactly the frequency we don't want to excite the system. So what happens? Now the lobes are getting bigger. And if the lobes are getting bigger, the force variation is getting bigger. And if the force variation is getting bigger, it's causing an excitation source to cause the guy to bounce up and down even more. And if he bounces up and down even more, what's going to happen? He's going to put even bigger lobes in the wheel. So now we have a vicious cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the problem causes a problem, the situation causes a problem, the problem exacerbates the problem exacerbates the problem. And next thing you know, we've got huge lobes on the wheel. And next thing you know, bang, 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 things are out of control. Things are just crazy madness because that wheel is no longer round. Now there's a simple solution: dress the wheel round again, and your problem of wheel regenerative chatter will go away. Just dress the wheel, make it round again. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem of workpiece regenerative chatter, but it does solve the problem of wheel regenerative chatter. Now, we've given an introduction here of, okay, what are the causes of wheel regenerative chatter? Not workpiece. Here we have workpiece regenerative chatter. Here we have wheel regenerative chatter. So my goal of this video is to explain to you the cause, the mechanisms, the fundamental situation that causes this self-excited chatter. Now, there are a bunch of solutions, possible solutions, semi-solutions that work some situations. Some solutions work in different situations. We're not getting into those in this video, but the purpose of this video is just to explain what is the cause, what is the fundamental mechanism of wheel regenerative chatter. If you'd like to learn more, take one of my courses. We do the 3-day high-intensity grinding course. Check out my other videos. Get a copy of the Book of Grinding. Turn a bunch of knobs and hope it goes away by itself. Something, whatever you want to do. But this purpose of this video is just to explain the fundamental mechanisms behind wheel regenerative chatter. And we talked about workpiece regenerative chatter. Wheel regenerative chatter takes longer to develop, and it gets worse over time. Might take 30 minutes to develop. Even longer for a CBN wheel, less for a aluminum oxide wheel because they wear quicker. Workpiece regenerative chatter typically occurs within a few seconds of contact, or as your wheel gets duller, maybe longer, but it happens pretty quickly. Wheel regenerative chatter takes longer. Okay, I hope you found this useful.